The Chinese Communist Party is waging war on the United States, and it's a war being fought in a way that we may not recognize as war. Instead of bombs and guns, it's being fought with businesses, investment, espionage, the whole 9 yards. And we have with us today one of the top experts on this issue, Brigadier General Robert Spalding. Now, Spalding is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He was also a senior advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon. He wrote a book just recently called Stealth War, which lays out this whole strategy, the whole issue, what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, and he's here with us today to tell us about this. So everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. We'll get started now. So General, first, I guess tell us about, you mentioned this different form of warfare that the Chinese Communist Party is waging, and in your book, you paint this picture that the U.S. has been kind of asleep at the wheel. Where are things at right now? It seems, from what I get, they're starting to wake up. It's just starting to happen. So tell us about this.
So, the national security strategy that came out in December of 2017 actually gave a guidepost, if you will, for the executive branch of the government to begin to focus on what the Chinese Communist Party was doing. And so agencies like the Department of Justice and the FBI, State Department, the Department of Defense, really starting to change their approach to how they deal with the Chinese Communist Party. And you're starting to see in the news media the arrest or expulsion of, Ministry of State Security and other types of spies that are here in the United States. But really also the tariffs that you see that have been in place as a result of the Section 301 investigation from the U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador Lighthizer, the focus now on particularly the use of U.S. capital funds, particularly from our retirement funds, into Chinese equities. It's tremendous, and so that's being pushed by Senator Rubio. So it's not just in the executive branch; it's also in the legislative branch that's beginning to focus on this.
It's good to see it's actually become somewhat bipartisan.
It's very bipartisan. In fact, as the Republicans and the Democrats are both equally coming to realize the challenge to our democracy of the Chinese Communist Party. So it's great. I mean, it's needed. It can't happen fast enough for me, but at the same time, I can see every single day we're making progress.
Now, you describe this as a war, and this is not a war in terms of how we normally understand war. How can you explain this to us?
Well, in the West, we trace our thinking about war to some scholars like Clausewitz. Clausewitz talked about war as being politics by other means. Jomini talked about using mass at the weakest point, and Julio Duhay said use an airplane to do it. And so if you think about the evolution of the U.S. way of war, it's been very much about dominating the battlefield to use military force to impose your will on an adversary. And you have to essentially contrast that with the Chinese way of making war. Sun Tzu talks about, how do you achieve victory without actually going to war. In fact, war is looked at, particularly in the Three Kingdoms period, war is looked at something as a last resort where everything else has failed. You try to get your adversaries to fight amongst each other, you use spies, you coerce through payments, you find all kinds of ways to prevent having to go to war, because war ultimately is a risky endeavor and you don't know what the outcome is. Of course, then you look at Mao's approach to warfare, which was really called People's War, and it was really about changing Clausewitz's view of war is politics by other means to politics is war by other means. And so really it becomes about controlling, rather than in the U.S. method of warfare, controlling the battlefield, it becomes about controlling the narrative. And if you can control the narrative, as Confucius said in his Analects, what would you do if you were made emperor? And he said, I would rectify the names. And it really expresses the kind of Chinese concept of controlling the narrative, controlling the way people think about something, and that allows them to, in controlling the speech about a thing, allows you to control what people think about a thing. So if you take that notion of warfare and now you plop it into a world that's fully globalized and connected via the internet, now you have the ability to surpass kind of the limitations of People's War, where you had to have geography. And so Mao had the geography and the people he could operate within. Now you can extend that beyond your borders. You can use economic, financial, and informational ties around the world to control the narrative, not just within China, but also outside of China. And you can develop proxies using, financial relationships. So associations like the National Basketball Association, you can get them to actually begin to think about, suppressing speech because of the profits they may lose in China. And so it's a very powerful tool in a totalitarian regime run by the Communist Party to be able to control a narrative in today's globalized world.
Well, and the realm the realm of ideology is a huge one, in my opinion. And I've been shocked to see that a lot of people in the defense community don't usually regard ideology as an important domain of warfare. They changed a bit with counterinsurgency and coin and stuff like that, but really the U.S. is not very much engaged in ideological warfare. But when we look at the Chinese Communist Party, they have the three warfares doctrine, right? Media warfare, legal warfare, and psychological warfare, changing the way you interpret information. For them, this is it. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think from the United States perspective, if you can dominate a foe militarily, you have the ability to control the narrative, because you can basically set the conditions, the political conditions, by essentially bringing in martial law. Like, you have troops on the ground, you can coerce to your heart's content. I think the challenge is if you're not going to have a total war scenario like World War II, then it's entirely a different story in terms of how do you create those impressions in a population that doesn't want to have that. So Iraq, Afghanistan, very difficult to control the narrative. You're not really willing to do things like MacArthur did in Japan in terms of actually writing the Constitution and enforcing it on the population. I think it's a completely different thing when you're trying to do it in a world where you're not at total war. And I think that's the world we find ourselves today for a lot of good reasons. And so in that scenario, in a world where you're not looking at total war and you don't want total war, because why? You have nuclear weapons, which could be devastating for the entire world.
You were a B-2 pilot, well, there's
I know all about those weapons, and they're terrible weapons, but they are used still for deterrence. So in that world where you don't want to go to war with your adversary because of the terrible nature of nuclear weapons, and you have globalization and the internet, it gives you, it really transfers the ability to be dominant in that space from the West, which is typically about dominating the military battlefield, to China, because they have basically perfected dominating the narrative. And we certainly understand how to have political campaigns in the West, but it's almost political campaigns on steroids, when you bring in all of the ability to have the corruption and use all the elements of the state to enforce your will. Here in the West, it's typically, a political party against a political party, and they're, whatever means that they can get from the population to drive their campaigns is the limit. But in China, you have the number 2 economy in the world, $13 trillion GDP. You have the military, you have the People's Armed Police, you have the Ministry of State Security, you have the entire banking system of China, you have all the research labs and all of the scientists on your side. So it's really a completely different ball game.
So in your book, you describe 6 spheres of influence, and when we get into Chinese warfare, it's a whole different picture. And I've worked on this a lot as an investigative reporter, that they talk about unrestricted warfare. It was an official document, wasn't official, but we can see it implemented. And the way they kind of worked on their system of warfare is, what is the goal of war, and how do we achieve that without having to engage in troop-on-troop combat? And like you said, they control every part of their society. They can use every single part of their society as a weapon. And so you break this down to 6 parts. Explain these to us.
Well, first of all, I could have spent several years and wrote several volumes about what the Chinese Communist Party does, but my intent was to get it out as soon as I could to the American people. And that's why I left the Air Force, and that's why I'm going around talking about the book, because I think it's so important. So the idea was to have it accessible. You know, you don't want to overwhelm people because it is so expansive. So I did talk about, you know, kind of the elements of the economy and how they're using their military differently, the Belt and Road Initiative, Made in China 2025. You know, a lot of the major elements of what they do for unrestricted warfare, but I didn't talk about everything. And so the bottom line is the institutions of the West, whether it be finance, investment, trade, immigration, media, politics, the internet, academia, all of them were considered at one point to be strengths. And so essentially the way we approached China was to use a philosophy of open markets lead to wealth, and wealth leads to democracy, and if we open up, eventually China would democratize. And so what happened was, particularly after the Tiananmen massacre, the Chinese Communist Party essentially, and this is it's detailed in the Tiananmen papers that were smuggled out, really comes to this conclusion that they're going to have to do a much better job pushing ideology into the population, because the U.S. was trying to overthrow the Communist Party. And so they need globalization, they need the internet, but they're going to have to protect their population from figuring out this thing called democracy. So the Great Firewall, using the tools of the West, which are primarily innovation, technology, talent, and capital, to grow the power of the Chinese Communist Party. And they do that by creating a social contract based on, we will deliver continuous economic growth to you if you promise not to challenge us politically. No freedom of speech, no freedom of religion, no freedom from oppression. And primarily, or most of all, they've been successful. If you look across the last 3 decades, Europe has flatlined, America has flatlined, Asia's flatlined economically. All the major economic players have been pretty much stagnant, except China's been growing. And you think, well, that defies all the laws of economics. But in reality, when Xi goes to Davos and says, we need globalization, we need to be collaborative and cooperative, he's really saying, we need you, West, to stay open for business so we can continue to harvest technology, talent, innovation, and capital, so that we can keep growing our economic and science and technological power, so our people won't overthrow us.
And so what is the goal, first off? And two, of course, you talked about the China model. What would the world look like if they were to succeed in that?
So the world would look like you living in the United States, raising your children, and every day teaching your children what are the things they can say and what they can't say to prevent them from angering the Chinese Communist Party and creating challenges for your family. In other words, your kid can't get into a school, you can't get a job, you can't buy a home. All of these things that we're seeing, like I talk about in the book, the firing of Roy Jones because he liked to tweet, and he's working for Marriott Corporation in Omaha, Nebraska. All of those things that we see happening in our society today, the joblessness, the deaths as a result of fentanyl, the ability to coerce U.S. corporations to suppress the speech of their employees, all of those things begin to become more and more endemic in democratic societies, to the point where you're no longer living in the land of the free. You're really living in the land of the totalitarian state that is in a lot of ways subject to the whims of the Chinese Communist Party.
And you mentioned that the Bill of Rights, the U.S. Constitution, are major challenges to that. And do you think this is why they view the U.S. as such a big adversary?
I think it's, so when I was at the Pentagon and we were working on the kind of the notional national security strategy that we might implement create if a new administration came in that was willing to push back against the Chinese Communist Party, one of the things that you begin to see is not only have we damaged our defense industrial base, the ability to build the things to protect ourselves, but also in losing that industrial base, the people that were working there essentially suffered. So all of the anger and hurt that led to kind of the rise of, on the left, of Bernie Sanders and on the right of Donald Trump, really came out of this destruction of, the working class in America. And it was really destroyed on the basis of, the Chinese Communist Party trying to deliver jobs to the Chinese people in order to prevent from having to deal with another Tiananmen Square.
Yeah, there you go. Seize the means of production. Who controls the means of production? Who controls the factories? Who controls the jobs? Who controls innovation? Who controls the natural resources, the shipping lanes? This is a bigger picture than what a lot of us usually think of.
Right, and it's they've been extremely successful at it. And the way they've been successful is essentially by co-opting the elites of the West, the people that owned the factories. They were able to get higher margins. Now here in the United States, we have labor laws, we have environmental laws that were built up after our industrial revolution, where we're exploiting workers and we're polluting the land. And here was an opportunity that they saw to get out from under the requirement that you actually treat your employees with respect and not poison your own backyard, and move production over to China, where the Chinese Communist Party is more than happy to allow you to exploit the Chinese people and to pollute China to the hilt. And so if you go and live in China now, and I did in Shanghai, and you see not only how bad Chinese workers have it in terms of their lives, but also how poisoned the environment is. And you look at the West and you say, well, all of these people made tons of money on what is something that's ostensibly counter to what they say in the West. And what they say in the West is, and what they say at Davos is, we need to protect the environment from climate change, right? But they're not willing to do manufacturing in the United States, where you have rules that actually protect the environment. They want to go off to China, where you don't have to protect the environment, and they don't want to. They talk about creating a level playing field for Americans. One of the favorite topics now is we're going to give people a living wage, because we've gotten so rich that we're embarrassed about it, and the fact that these people in middle America don't have jobs. Well, they don't want a living wage. They want a job brings dignity. And so not only do they not understand what's happened to the society, they don't understand that it creates this vacuum into which the Chinese Communist Party can come in and sow interest in things like socialism and communism.
And if we look at the history of ideological subversion, which a lot of the modern Chinese warfare is based off of, Soviet model type stuff, and of course older stuff as well. This seems to be part of the goal. And I think this is part of what you outline in your book. You mentioned fentanyl. We could look at drug warfare. There's culture warfare, controlling Hollywood. There's the Faustian deal a lot of our big corporate heads make when they go to China. And you talk about this stuff. So tell us, what we're seeing in this country, the problems we're seeing, and you tie it back to China. Do you think they're doing this intentionally?
Oh, absolutely. Because it's to paraphrase Xi, it's win-win, right? If I can keep my factory employees in the pharmaceutical industry employed, producing a product that can be sold, and oh, by the way, that product goes to America and kills their workers, it's win-win for me, because I'm creating chaos in America, and I'm keeping my people in China employed. And so we have to think in terms of systemic answers to those challenges, because recently, just yesterday, they announced that they arrested 9 people in China for smuggling fentanyl. And our media, eats it up. They say, wow, that's wonderful. It shows that the Chinese are cooperating with us. And in fact, our own, agencies say, yes, Drug Enforcement Agency, the Chinese are cooperating with us. But the Chinese Communist Party is absolutely thrilled to sacrifice a few Chinese people for a media narrative that says they're cooperating on fentanyl. Meanwhile, if you look at the numbers, there's no change. In fact, there's an increase in the flow of fentanyl that I would imagine that you're going to see. So the flow of fentanyl doesn't stop in the United States, but at the same time, we think, we've solved the problem. Time to go on to the next thing. So this is a challenge for us.
And I know in your book you talked about this kind of epiphany you had, where you saw what was happening, and you were pretty, you really saw it for what it was. And from what I get, you realize that a lot of people in the U.S. government did not see it yet. And so that's, of course, what inspired you to write this, from what I understand. Where do you think things are at right now in terms of the U.S. government realizing what's taking place and doing something about it?
So what's happening now is there's a realization, first of all, that we've got a problem. What the difficulty for the West is, how do we use the tools, the authorities that governments have, to counter the things that China has basically spent 3 decades architecting? And so, you know, institutions like the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, the Defense Department are used to, in the case of SEC, Treasury, and Commerce, used to, you know, this idea of globalization. And now they have to realize globalization actually creates a challenge for the competitiveness of America economically and financially. So how do we protect our institutions from that? And the Defense Department, which gets $800 billion a year, realizes that, you know, another carrier battle group is not going to stop the Greeks from signing, you know, contracts to sell the Port of Piraeus to the Chinese Communist Party. So somehow they need to use their authorities differently. So it's starting, but I think it's going to be a decades-long process for the federal government to actually realize what needs to be done, and then fully architect it in a way that we can promote our democracy going forward. Most importantly is the internet, and quite frankly, we haven't woken up, and this is, I think, the major challenges for democracies of how powerful the internet is for totalitarians today, and it's really about the strategic nature of data in a 21st century world. AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. Data is a fuel for those things, and the data model that we have today, which allows the accumulation of data both in large tech companies in the private sector in the West and for the Chinese Communist Party in China and other totalitarian regimes, really shift the balance away from the Western democracies to totalitarian regimes. And so really, with the introduction of 5G networks, the ability, the digital Silk Road, and the ability to aggregate all that data and then use big data analysis, machine learning, and artificial intelligence to really not only provide economic benefit for the Chinese Communist Party, but also feed the propaganda arm of the Chinese Communist Party and the intelligence arm of the People's Liberation Army. It's a really powerful concoction. And so we wrote in the National Security Strategy, we need a secure nationwide 5G network. And that was meant to demonstrate that in order to keep democracies free in a digitized world, that data would have to be encrypted. Your data would have to be owned by you, not owned by anybody else. And until we do that, I think we're still going to be under threat, even considering all of what the federal government's currently doing. And finally, the big piece that we need to add on to that is invest in our own infrastructure, industrial base, STEM education, research and development, all things, by the way, that we're doing during the Cold War. So really, if you look at Eisenhower's strategy, it's very much like Eisenhower's strategy, build the economic and science and technological strength of the United States. But there's an added twist today because the internet really connects us in ways that Eisenhower didn't have to deal with.
Great. So General, where can people find your book?
It's on Amazon, it's on Barnes & Nobles, it's on all the major booksellers. It's in audio form, it's in electronic form, and hard copy. So.
Great. Hey, real pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great. And everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.